Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio, a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto is and always will be educate, enlighten, entertain, with hosts Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurtzel, and Lillian Caldwell. Today, we're going to review what we discussed for the first 2 months of our series, Lest We Forget, the U.S. and human trafficking, the U.S. and the Holocaust, and in February, human trafficking. So we'll start off with me, and then we'll go to Betsy, and then we'll go to Lisa. So what would you like to know? Well, we understand that many people in our country do not believe that the Holocaust ever took place. And that makes me angry because my family lost more than half of its relatives in the Holocaust. I cannot trace my family back to Adam and Eve because my family ceased to exist after the 1940s. They just weren't there anymore. One of our celebrities in our country, an African American, who appeared on The Review and subsequent news outlets, Whoopi Goldberg, made a statement during the week saying that she did not believe that the Holocaust was based on race. Ms. Goldberg, could you explain why the gentleman who was an African American who appeared in the 1930s Olympics was prohibited by Hitler to show up because he was number one in the world for running? And I'll tell you why. Because in his mind, a black person could not show up a white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed person. That's definitely race, Miss Goldberg. The other story I have to tell you is even personal. When I was going to college during the late 60s, early 70s, our school shared a cafeteria with a Christian college. So both students from my college and the students from the Christian college ate in there, and they had people from all over the world. One of the people who was in my class, her name was Hazel, and she was part of the Black Panther movement. And one day, as I was eating my liver, I glanced over in her general direction. Now, I glance over in all general directions when I eat because I am lost in thought. And she came over and dumped her dinner all over me and said in her most nastiest voice, "Why are you staring at me?" And I said, "I'm not staring at you. I am looking through you." And she made an attempt to punch me at my face. Well, an African seminary student who was studying at the college came up and held her fist from going in my face and said, what Elizabeth was trying to say was that when she thinks, she doesn't see anybody. It's nothing personal. But because you made the assumption that she was looking through you, you were telling her that you do exist. And she wasn't talking about anything like that at all. So I don't like it when anybody infers that the Holocaust never happened, that Jews were never discriminated against in Germany or in Europe or in Eastern Asia, because that's not true. History has bared it out that we have been the cause of many types of violence against us because people have believed from the beginning of the time that we're responsible, and we're not. People can't stand being different. People don't like dissenters. They don't like people who are different from them in face, form, color. It doesn't matter. But it doesn't give the right to anybody to say to my face or any other face, whatever color, religion, or identity you have, that nothing happened, or it's not about a 1, 2, 3, because they weren't there. And I don't like being treated like that. So, Miss Goldberg, I can say to you that A, the blacks aren't the only ones who've been discriminated against. B, your family or ancestors were not the only ones that were whipped or sold. And C, before you make an inaccurate statement like that, please do your research.
May I add to that?
Yes.
So that statement just really surprises me. And we did a lot of research on this subject, the three of us. And one of the things that we all learned, and I think that this completely contradicts what Whoopi Goldberg is saying, is that it was very clear to all of us doing our research that the Jews, and I'm not saying it was exclusively Jews. I will say that one of the things that we did learn is within the more than 6 million people that were annihilated, murdered, gassed during World War II, the majority of them were Jewish, but not all of them.
But not, they went after the gypsies. He went after the blacks.
Anybody who resisted the Nazis is what we learned. And that included Christians and Catholics and priests, and anybody who resisted them was put to death. But the majority of those people happened to be Jewish. And it was very clear that the Jewish people were segregated during this period of time in history from everybody else. They were not allowed to practice their professions. The children were no longer allowed to go to the same schools as the other children. And they were forced to be identified by wearing armbands with letters on them that identified them as being Jewish, with J's on the armbands and other means to identify them as being the Jewish population. Now, if that's not based on race, I clearly don't understand what is based on race. So anyway, I just wanted to add that because, and then we have learned a lot of very, very similar attitudes in these other atrocities that we've been discussing. And we are about to start our Native American series. I've done lots of research already on that. And you will hear the exact same scenario that we are talking about right now and that we have brought to light in these episodes. It happened also to the Native American population in the United States, and it was egregious. So listen next week because we've got some really, really sobering information to discuss with you about that genocide. But anyway, I think that based on what the three of us uncovered in our research for the Holocaust, for human trafficking, for prostitution, it's clearly based on race and judgments about people. I don't think there's any argument about that.
No, and the United States was just as bad as Germany. We put first and second generation Japanese families into an atmosphere like a concentration camp. No, we didn't burn them in gas chambers, but we did everything else to them. Or look what we did to the Chinese that came over to our land who built the railroad. Frankly, Miss Goldberg, we would not have the railroad today if it hadn't been for the Chinese who came over and built the railroad for us. You really need to understand there's a lot more to history than making a flat statement that it isn't race, the world is flat, because it's not.
Well, you know what? That reminds me also about the act that was passed in the 1800s after Chinese immigrated here and built these railroads for us. And then all of a sudden they were tossed out of the country and not allowed to come in. And it was specifically Chinese people. And only Chinese people. That was the very first act ever passed in this country that disallowed a certain race to immigrate into this country. And that lasted for decades.
I have a comment. I watched the clip of Whoopi Goldberg on The View. And in her mind, she didn't think it was race related because Jews are white. So she thought, oh, well, they're white, so it's not racist. What she didn't understand, and she should educate herself, and I have to say this, I say this on my own show, and I'll say it on this show, we will talk about the uncomfortable, because we need to, until it becomes comfortable. So, if we get hate mail, we get hate mail. That's okay. But nowhere in this world were the Jews welcomed. Now, Germany thought of Jews as subhuman. The Ku Klux Klan doesn't even think we're white. So do I mark when they ask you what your race is? Should I mark other? Because I'm wondering that now because, and I was talking to someone that I was interviewed. She wrote a book about the Holocaust. Why aren't Jews recognized for their nationality other than being Jewish? They could be German, but they're not seen as German. They could be French, Spanish, but they're not recognized. And always, as European history was, the Jews were never fully accepted. They stayed in the little chateaus, the little villages. They intermingled amongst the other people, the Gentiles, when they had to for business. But the Jews were always shunned. Even in the art world, they were shunned. And even Poland, the Queen welcomed the Jews. The Jews lived in these countries for years and years, and yet they weren't accepted. And France, nothing against the French people, so don't take this the wrong way, with the Vichy government, they had more strict rules for the Jews than the Germans. They handed their Jews over in a silver platter.
So did the Poles. Yes.
Yeah.
All did. They all did.
It's really mind-boggling. And the younger generation, unless we talk about it, it won't be spoken about. How would you feel of living in fear every day of your life, hiding in a closet, hiding in a basement, petrified? In a sewer. My grandparents, my mother's parents, I thought they had left before World War I, but they didn't. They ran during World War I. And they didn't tell us all the horrible stories, how they hid in basements for days, how they saw someone suffocate a baby so they wouldn't be found. We can't even imagine the terror. But I will tell you, my own personal experience, my parents' house was graffiti, thankfully with shaving cream in the 60s. Could have been early 70s. Maybe it was early 70s. I think it was my brother's friend. We had the biggest backyard in the neighborhood. Nobody was turned away. And yet they did this. I felt violated. I felt afraid and violated that somebody would do this. I was called names by my neighbors. I was called names walking to school. You dirty Jew, you Jew bagel.
Killer of Christ, killer of
Yes,
babies.
yes. One neighbor told my mother, Tommy may come over and stare at you because he was told Jews have horns coming out of their head. This is just, like I said, mind-boggling. But I learned so much from the research that you did, Lillian, and Lisa did. Really, I did not know that Adolf Hitler took the U.S. Policies and made it his own and then added a twist to it. Was amazed. I was really educated. So I thank you for having me part of the show. And I'm learning a lot. Thank you.
We haven't mentioned, since there's a lot of attention being put on Russia these days with their invasion of Ukraine, I do want to make mention that there is a huge population of Jewish people in Russia and in Ukraine, but they're considered to be Russians or Ukrainians. You don't hear, well, at least I haven't since this war started, but I know because I live by San Francisco, and there's a huge, huge community of Russian Jews who live there, a huge community of Russian Ukrainians who have immigrated to this area. And I know, I don't think anybody can really support that argument that, yeah, the Jewish is a religion, but it has been turned into a segregated race. And that's clear and evident based on what? History.
Yes. I mean, if you take a look at all the European and Far Eastern countries that have outlawed and thrown the Jews out, the African Americans have nothing to complain about. Africa still loves them. They don't love us. I remember when I was doing research for the anime mysteries, and also for the second book, The Seven Keys of Solomon, when the communist government took over Ethiopia, they had to airlift all the Jews out of Ethiopia, or they would have been slaughtered.
And please don't get us wrong, because we are discussing many, many, many of the atrocities that have occurred throughout history, and we haven't gotten to it yet, but it's on our calendar and our schedule that we will thoroughly discuss the atrocity that happened right here in the United States with slavery. That's coming.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
It's a lot of people today, our age group, we know about it, but there were race riots in Newark, and they leveled the city of Newark. How did the mayor get around? In a Sherman tank. He borrowed it from the military so that he could survey what happened to his city. A Sherman tank in the 1960s, ladies and gentlemen, think about it. What would you do if you had a Sherman tank go down the center street of San Francisco or Los Angeles or Chicago? When I was growing up, and I'm sure Lisa and Betsy would say, they were still having military jeeps, tanks, trucks, soldiers being transported all over the United States. And the war was over, but they were still doing this. Why? Because they were trying to redistribute what the military used during the war. And you would see these weapons to our eyes of mass destruction. I have seen the cannon mounted on a Sherman tank. I know what it can do. I wasn't watching it on TV because TV wasn't invented until the 50s, and they weren't that advanced in those days. I mean, we're talking about when computers were 2 football fields long. So Our generation, the 50s and the late 40s, were the beginning of all television, radio, movies. You take all this for granted, but it couldn't have been done until after World War II. And yes, the Germans showed us how it was done. And if you don't remember this, please remember the reason why we got to the moon was because the Nazi scientists were welcomed into the States with open arms from our government and allowed to stay, even though they were, quote, party members, unquote, because they had the knowledge of rockets. Hitler was trying to come up with his own atomic bomb, and he was trying to create a death ray up in outer space to wipe out the United States and other countries who supported the Allies against him. So don't think he was a nice guy, because he wasn't. You don't establish empires by being nice. Betsy, you have anything to add?
Well, I want to support something that Betsy commented about when she said that the Nazis were convinced by their leader that Jewish people, not the religion, but Jewish people were subhuman. And we know for a fact that Hitler referred to the Jewish people to indoctrinate his followers to believe this. What were some of the terms he used? I'm recalling parasite. I'm recalling lice. I'm recalling that they're not pure enough to reproduce because they aren't of the same caliber as the Aryan race. Add to this, if I'm sure I'm missing many of the things that, but those come to mind that those are some of his descriptive words that he used about the Jewish people. Oh, that Jewish people are all greedy and all they care about is money and they only have one agenda. And this spilled over into the United States.
Absolutely. Down south, even dogs have a higher status than we do. Although on the signs on the bathrooms down there and restaurants, no dogs or Jews allowed.
That's right. And when Roosevelt was kind of surveying the public opinion about whether or not to loosen the Immigration Act that had been currently in place, people said to him, well, it was part of the survey, and this influenced his decision tremendously, that we don't want them coming here because they're going to take what little food there is, what little jobs there are, and we know that their plan is to take us over. And this all came from the indoctrination and propaganda that Hitler was using to turn his followers against Jewish people.
It makes you wonder how, as a nation, we can go to sleep at night with our conscience cleared. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, just to refresh your memory, the Jews were here first, not the Christians, not the Protestants, not the Buddhists, Confucius. The Jews were here first. And then all those other religions came out of the Jewish faith.
Mm-hmm. And you know what makes this probably more ironic than any other fact on this planet? Is all these people who worship Jesus Christ. And what was he? He was a Jewish man.
He was Jewish. Right. He was circumcised, folks. It was their law to prevent cancer on the tip of their penis. My son was circumcised, and he went to a Christian church. That was the first thing the doctor did when he was born. They circumcised him because it was a health reason. Guess those Jews knew what they were talking about, huh?
So how is it that we could worship one man who was the leader of the Jewish religion and despise the rest? Something's wrong with this picture.
Yep.
And you would think 5,000 years later, we would try and do something about it? I mean, I've heard the Christianity is called a cult. You don't hear that about the Jewish religion.
Mm-hmm. That's right. All the disciples, I think, were Jewish.
Yes.
And as far, I mean, this is my own personal opinion, there is no way someone can call themselves a Christian, and I don't care if I offend anyone, to call me Don Rickles. I just don't care who I offend, because I'm going to speak my truth. There is no way you can be a Bible-believing Christian, love Jesus, and hate Jews. Because if you hate Jews, then you hate Jesus.
And you hate yourself.
You hate yourself. That's right. So I don't get it. And by the way, where Jesus was from, he probably had dark skin.
Very dark skin.
Yeah.
The blue-eyed blonde came from the Renaissance, ladies and gentlemen. Their models were in Italy, and they're blonde and blue-eyed. I understand the blonde hair comes more from northern Italy than the southern Italy, which is more dark hair, but they do have blondes in Italy. So before you cast any stones, think about the stone hitting you, or judge lest ye be judged yourself. I mean, let's face it, Miss Goldberg. Can you honestly say that you're a good Christian because you're judging somebody and they in turn may be judging you? I raised my kid by the 10 Commandments. Even today, he's very careful what words he uses and flings out for all posterity to hear him. Words hurt, words kill, words incite revolutions, words can get you into the Inquisition where you're tortured to death. Words are very dangerous. And when you're put in a position of power, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And lest we forget, the entire objective and point to this series is to resurrect these horrific acts that have been done by humans to other humans throughout history. And again, it's not just about the Jewish race. It's about every race that we can identify as being victims of this motive operandus. And it has pretty much hit just about every race that ever walked the earth, and we're getting to all of them. But we feel, the three of us feel, that it is so important to remind everybody, because with Lillian's vision and the title to the show being Lest We Forget, we're going to continue to see this cycle of terror continue throughout generations if we don't start being nicer to each other and accepting each other as just that, being human beings, and not try to put, each race into its own separate bucket and then try to convince ourselves that there's something wrong with each race. Look what they've done recently post-COVID to the Chinese again. I can't tell you how much violence I would see on television against the Chinese people because they are being blamed for the COVID pandemic. How ridiculous does that sound? It's not anybody's fault. It just is what it is, and we have to deal with it, just like everything else that challenges us in this life of ours.
You have anything to add, Betsy?
Oh, yes. It went out of my head. Now I remember. It's funny how Whoopi Goldberg picks a Jewish last name. You know, that's pretty funny from what her name is, Karen Johnson, and she goes by Whoopi Goldberg. I just want to say that during the civil rights, I know we'll cover this, the Jews helped the African Americans. The Jews helped the African Americans vote. A couple of Jews were killed. The movie Mississippi Burning covers that. We marched because we know what it's like. And so the Jews were very much involved with the civil rights movement. And I learned through doing the show, lest we forget, that I didn't realize that there were signs in America, Jews not allowed. I did not know that until I did this show. So I'm learning about things that I didn't know about. I know that Jews were not allowed to go to country clubs. Some companies did not allow Jews to work there, not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And when I was growing up, we were taught to stay with our own.
Yeah.
And if you married outside of being Jewish, that was really a scandal.
You were shunned.
Yes.
You were shunned. You were cast out of the family. My cousin John married a nice Filipino lady, and he was cut off. He stopped to exist. His name was taken out of the Bible. He was no longer part of the synagogue, and he was treated as an outcast. You could not talk to him. But when he had his son, Mommy and Daddy said, well, we'll work with it. So what does that say about the old style conservative Jews? They're no worse and no better than how the Christians do it when Christians marry a Jew. When my first husband, he was Methodist, married me, his father says to me, are you going to Jew him out of his money? Using Jews as a verb. And I was sheltered. My parents protected me, but even I knew what he said. So my husband, I think the only thing he ever did was to stand up to his father and said, this Jew is my wife, and you will either treat her with respect or she and I are leaving, never to return. And I know that took a lot of courage on his part because he was very close to his parents. But the thing of the matter is that these things are passed down from one generation to the other. So people who are listening to Lest We Forget, I hope you pay attention to what we say today. This show is not meant to upset people, unless, of course, they need a little bit of jarring from what they've heard in the last several centuries. The United States is a young country compared to the European country, especially compared to the Asian countries. China is 5,000 years older than we are. So we still have a lot to learn, but behavior is behavior. And we haven't gone beyond that of the caveman. And we really need to step up to the plate. So I'm going to close down the program. We want to thank you for joining us today. If we upset you, Well, I've been very upset from all the celebrities who say nasty things about the Jewish people, and I've never had a loud enough voice because what am I? Just a peon, and they won't recognize me, nor will their agents receive anything from me because I'm not above the law as they seem to believe they are. So that's why we're having this program. So Betsy, Lisa, and I can put out what the common man, the peons, feel when your big wigs in the other part of the world get away with things because you are put in that position by your peers. So if you want to contact me, it's pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Betsy, email, please.
Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY 31 @gmail.com.
Lisa?
Mine is dementia whisperer1 @gmail.com. Thank you for listening to us today, and we hope and pray that we gave you some really important content to at least think about.
If nothing else, talk to your children about it, because your children are the ones who are living through the drama. Just to give you a case in point, my son married a full Chinese lady, so his children are half Chinese. Don't you believe they were bullied, not just by their schoolmates, but the teachers in school because they were half-breeds? So it's not just our generation, it's now showing up in their generation. And I really hope that we can do something about it because it shouldn't be showing up in any further or future generation. Thank you all very much for listening. You can catch us on youtube.com/PWR Network _PW Talk Radio, on Facebook.com/Passionate World Radio, on our website, https:// World Talk Radio Network. And coming to your station soon, we are now being heard on Hype Media Global. It's a terrestrial FM station, and the link is Betsy, Chatting with Betsy. It's heard every Monday from 10 to 11 a.m. So it's hypemediaglobal.com/Chatting with Betsy. And then on Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., it is either Cool Your Heels with Lillian Caldwell, or you guessed it, I am putting Lisa Skinner in with Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. I'm putting in Sports Commentary with Dan Riley. I'm putting in Stop Healthcare Violence with Sheila Wilson. I'm putting in Finding Love in All the Wrong Places by Dr. D. Carroll. The station, additional podcasts will be heard on Wednesday morning. So look up hypermediaglobal.com, and it will tell you the 2 FM stations that you can listen to us on. So go and listen. Thank you all very much for listening. And remember, please join us next Friday at 3 p.m. lest with a T we forget, and we will be discussing the almost genocide of the American Indian. A side note or your call to action is this: if you feel there is an atrocity or something that you want to have discussed on Lest We Forget, please email one of us with your ideas. There is also a form on our website. Nobody uses it for the right purpose, so you might as well put your name and your comments in there of what you would like to hear on Lest We Forget. Thank you all very much, and have a great Easter and a great egg hunting weekend.
All right.